She was 41 years old, and she was standing in the road with everything she owned in a flour sack and $6.40 sewn into the hem of her coat. The man who put her there was Silas Crane, president of the Merchants and Stockmen's Bank of Providence Bend, Colorado, who had called in her dead husband's death 11 days after the funeral and had the sheriff post her door before the frost was off the windows. $6.40. That was the whole of it, the wage of 20 years of honest living. And what did she do with it, this woman with no roof and no kin and winter coming down off the front range like a slow gray tide? She walked to the railroad salvage auction at the edge of town, and she paid $6 of those dollars for the one thing nobody else would bid on, a rusted, forgotten freight car that had sat on a dead spur for 15 years, a car with a lock that no man in 3 counties had ever managed to open. Folks said she'd lost her mind along with her house. But sealed inside that car was something that would not only change her life, it would shake loose a secret this town had buried for a generation, and give back to Providence Bend everything it thought it had lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Voss Mercer. If you're watching from a place the world seems to have forgotten, tell us where in the comments, because this story is for you. To understand what Ada did that cold October morning in 1899, you have to go back 30 years, to a small clapboard depot on the eastern edge of Providence Bend, where a girl with 2 dark braids sat on a stool behind the freight counter and watched her father work. Elias Voss was the station agent, and he was something more than that besides. He was a locksmith, trained back in Ohio before the war. A man who could take a jammed padlock in his scarred brown hands and coax it open the way another man might gentle a spooked horse. He kept a wooden case of picks and tension wrenches and tiny brass keys, each one filed by hand, and in the evenings, when the last train had moaned away toward Denver and the lamps were lit, he would set a lock on the counter in front of his daughter and say the words she would carry all her life: "Everything closed wants to be opened, Ada. You just have to listen long enough to learn its language." She learned. By 10 she could open the depot's storeroom blind, by touch alone, feeling the tumblers lift and seat like piano keys under her fingertips. By 14 she could take apart her father's own 3-wafer signature lock, the one he built himself and stamped with a small rising sun on the faceplate, the one he put on every strongbox and sealed car that passed through his charge, and put it back together in the dark. Her father used to laugh, a low warm sound like water over stones, and say that a lock was the most honest thing a man ever made, because it never pretended to be anything but what it was. People, he said, were harder. People could look open and be shut, or look shut and be waiting, all their lives, for one patient soul to listen. Her mother, Livy Voss, had died of the influenza when Ada was 7, and so the depot raised her as much as her father did. She grew up on the smell of coal smoke and axle grease and the sweet pine of new crates, on the rhythms of the telegraph sounder that clicked in the corner like a tin cricket. She learned the freight business the way other girls learned needlework, waybills and manifests, tare weights and demurrage. The sacred arithmetic of things entrusted from one pair of hands to another. Her father drilled it into her the way he drilled the locks. A manifest is a promise, he said. When a man ships his goods, he ships his trust along with them, and the agent who receives that trust holds it the way a preacher holds a soul. And Providence Bend, in those years, was a town worth trusting. It sat in a wide bend of the Solomon Fork, wheat land rolling gold to the east and the blue shoulders of the mountain standing guard to the west, and it had a main street of honest brick, a schoolhouse with a bell, a white-steepled church, and about 900 people who mostly knew each other's middle names. Ada grew up in it and of it. She sang in the church choir off-key and unashamed. She hauled water for old widow Pruitt, who paid her in molasses cookies and stories about crossing the plains in '58. She learned, from her father and from the town both, the virtue that would shape her whole life and that would matter, years later, more than she could ever have guessed: patience. Not the meek kind, not the kind that waits because it is afraid to move, but the working kind, the locksmith's kind. The patience that believes every stubborn thing in this world will yield its secret to the one who refuses to quit listening. There was a young man around the depot in those years, too, a freight clerk named Silas Crane, lean and quick-eyed, always first to volunteer for the ledger work and last to help load a car. Her father was kind to him, taught him the manifests, vouched for him when the division superintendent came through. Ada, 12 years old, watched Silas Crane smile at her father with his mouth while his eyes went on counting something behind them, and she did not have a word for what she saw. She only knew that when Silas Crane looked at the freight in the warehouse, he did not look at it the way her father did, as trust made visible. He looked at it the way a coyote looks at a henhouse, patiently, yes, but it was the other kind of patience. She grew. She married, at 22, a carpenter named Voss Mercer. A big gentleman with sawdust in his beard who built her a house on Cedar Street with window seats in every room because she liked to read in the light. They were not rich and never would be. Owen built barns and coffins and church pews, and Ada kept his books to the penny and mended locks at her kitchen table for anyone who brought one. And if the good Lord did not see fit to send them children, he sent them each other, and for 20 years that was wealth enough. Her father lived his last years in a room off their kitchen, and she would hear him at night, turning some old lock over and over in his ruined hands, listening, always listening, because by then Elias Voss was a broken man, and the thing that broke him is the black seam running through the middle of this story. It happened in 1884, when Ada was 26. That was the year of the fire, the July night when a lightning strike and a dry wind took half of Providence Bend in 4 hours. The mill, the school, the church, 11 houses, the whole east side of Main Street, gone by morning, and 3 good people gone with it. The town stood in the ashes and might have died right there. But word went out on the wires, and something happened that Ada never forgot as long as she lived. The other towns answered. Denver answered, and Pueblo, and little places nobody in Providence Bend had ever seen, churches and lodges and ladies' aid societies from one end of the state to the other. They loaded a relief car. One single boxcar, packed in Denver over 3 weeks with everything a burned town needs to live again, tools and window glass, bolts of cloth and cases of books for the school, seed wheat, medicine. A new bronze bell cast in a St. Louis for the church that would be rebuilt, and, in an iron strongbox, a little over $11,000 in donated cash and the re-recorded land deeds for the 11 burned-out families. So no man could dispute their claims while they rebuilt. $11,000, in 1884, in a town on its knees. It was salvation on 8 wheels. The car never came. Somewhere between the Denver yards and Providence Bend, on a night of washouts and rerouted trains, relief car number 1131 simply vanished from the record. The railroad said it must have been lost when the Coyote Creek trestle went out, swept into the flood with 2 other cars, unrecoverable, regrettable, insured for a fraction of its worth. But the paperwork was wrong, and everyone could feel it was wrong, and when the division men came looking for someone to answer for the tangled waybills, they found that the last agent shown to have handled the car's manifest was the agent at Providence Bend. Elias Voss. Never mind that he swore the car had never reached his siding, never mind that he offered his books, his keys, his whole life for inspection. The railroad needed a name to write in the blank space, and a small-town agent nearing 60 was a cheap name to write. They did not jail him, there was no proof of anything, only the smear of suspicion, but they took his position, and the town, grieving and cheated and needing someone to blame, took the rest. Ada watched her father walk down Main Street through a silence worse than shouting. She watched Widow Pruitt, who had fed her cookies, cross to the other side of the road. And she watched Silas Crane, who had testified, so helpfully, so regretfully, that Mr. Voss had been irregular with the manifests that summer, receive, within the year, a position at the bank in recognition of his diligence, and begin his long, smooth climb. Elias Voss lived 14 more years under that shadow, and it bent him a little more each season, and when he died in the spring of 1898 the last thing he said to his daughter, with her hand in both of his, was this: "I never touched that car, Ada. But somebody did. Somebody shut it up somewhere, and a shut thing wants to be opened. You remember that. She promised him she would. She thought it was only grief talking. She buried him next to her mother on the hill above the river, and she thought the worst of her life was behind her. It was ahead of her. That same year, the fever came up the river valley in August like smoke, and Owen Mercer, who had never been sick a day in his life, was 3 weeks dying. Ada nursed him with a patience that outlasted her own strength. She was holding his hand at 4 o'clock on a September morning when the big gentleman let go of the world. And the silence that came into the house on Cedar Street after that was a thing she could feel on her skin. She was not given long to sit in it. Owen, it turned out, had signed a note at the Merchants and Stockmen's Bank 2 years before, money borrowed to buy lumber for the new Grange Hall, money the Grange was to repay him in shares. Money that in the confusion of the fever year had never quite been squared. It was the kind of debt that any banker with a human heart would have carried for a widow through the winter. Silas Crane was not that kind of banker. He came to her door himself, hat in hand, sorrow arranged carefully across his smooth gray face, and told her how the times were hard and his hands were tied and his directors insisted. And 11 days after she buried her husband the notice went up on her door, and the house with the window seats belonged to the bank. He offered, magnanimously, in front of witnesses, to buy her furniture, at a fair valuation, and the valuation was an insult, and she took it because winter does not negotiate. When it was all done and counted, Ada Voss Mercer, 41 years old, orphan, widow, daughter of a disgraced man, stood in the October road with a flour sack of clothes. Her father's wooden case of locksmith's tools, her mother's Bible, and $6.40. 20 years of honest living, and it fit in one hand. She could have gone to Denver and taken in sewing. She could have written to Owen's cousin in Missouri and lived on charity in a corner room. What she did instead, nobody in Providence Bend could explain, then or for a long time after. Because that same week, the railroad, clearing its books at the century's turn, scraping the rust off its old sidings, posted a salvage auction at the freight yard. Scrap iron, condemned handcars, a heap of worn rail, and one item listed at the bottom of the bill in the agent's cramped hand, one boxcar, derelict, no serial plate, on the old Coyote Creek spur. Sold as is, where is? Contents, if any, unknown. Car cannot be opened. Everyone in town knew that car. It had sat on the abandoned spur out past Coyote Creek for as long as most could remember, 15 years at least, maybe longer, half swallowed by chokecherry and wild plum. Its paint weathered to no color at all, its serial plate pried off or rusted away. Boys dared each other to sleep under it. Tramps had tried it, thieves had tried it, and once a whole crew from the railroad itself had tried it, with bars and hammers. And gotten nowhere, because the car's doors were not held by any common railroad seal but by a heavy, strange, beautifully made lock that turned smooth as butter and opened for no key and no pick that any man could bring to it. Folks called it the Judas car, though nobody remembered quite why, and the railroad, which had no record of owning it and no way inside it and no spur worth keeping under it, finally decided to sell it for whatever a fool would pay. On the morning of the auction Ada stood at the back of the small crowd in her black coat. And when the agent read the item out and the men laughed and someone hollered that they wouldn't give 2 bits for a box they couldn't open, she heard her own voice say, clear and steady, $6. She could not have told you, in that moment, why. She would tell you later that it was 3 things braided together. It was the lock, because a lock nobody could open was the one kind of trouble she had been trained for since she was 7 years old. It was the roof, because a boxcar, whatever else it was walls and a floor, and winter was coming, and pride is a poor blanket. And it was something underneath both of those, something she didn't dare say out loud, her father's voice, 14 months in the grave, saying somebody shut it up somewhere. And the shut thing wants to be opened. The agent said going once, going twice, in a voice full of pity, and the hammer fell, and the crowd chuckled and scattered. And Ada Voss Mercer walked 4 miles out the weed-grown spur to take possession of the only property she had left in the world, a dead car on a dead track. Bought with everything but her last 40 cents. She reached it in the long amber light of late afternoon, and the first thing she did was stand still and look at it, the way her father had taught her to look at any stubborn thing, without hurry. Without anger. It was a standard boxcar of the old style, longer bodied than the new ones, its wood siding silvered and checked, its iron fittings bearded orange with rust. The plum brush had grown up through the trucks. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass, unbothered. She walked its length twice, trailing her fingers along the siding, and then she came to the door, and to the lock, and her heart stopped in her chest like a dropped watch. She knew that lock. She had held its brothers 100 times. Heavy shackle, case shaped like a beehive, the keyway offset and slightly curved, and there, on the faceplate. Worn shallow by 15 years of rain but unmistakable to the fingers that had traced it in childhood, a small stamped rising sun. Her father's signature mark. Elias Voss's own 3-wafer lock, the lock he built by hand and put on nothing, except goods sealed under his personal charge as agent of Providence Bend. She stood in the weeds with her hand flat against the cold iron, and the whole world went very quiet, and she understood 2 things at once, the way you understand lightning. First, this car had reached Providence Bend. Whatever the railroad's book said, whatever the flood story claimed, her father had stood where she was standing, and had hung his own lock on this door. Which he would only ever have done to protect a cargo he considered sacred. And second, he had been telling the truth all along, and someone had needed, very badly, for the truth to drown at Coyote Creek. No man in 3 counties could open that lock, because no man in 3 counties had spent a childhood learning its language. Ada knelt in the grass, opened the wooden case of tools she had carried out of her ruined life, and began to listen. Her father's 3-wafer design had a trick in it, she had watched him build it into every one, a false gate on the 2nd wafer that would seize any pick that rushed, so that force and haste. The tools of thieves defeated themselves. The lock did not want cleverness. It wanted patience. It wanted someone who knew that the 2nd wafer had to be lifted and held and then let settle back a hair's breadth, like a breath released slowly, before the 3rd would speak at all. The sun went down over the mountains. The meadowlark hushed. And in the blue dusk of the worst month of her life, Ada Voss Mercer felt the last wafer seat under her pick with a click as soft as a heartbeat. And the shackle of her father's lock swung open in her hands for the first time in 15 years, and she hauled back the great door on its screaming rollers, and struck a match, and looked inside. The match trembled. The little light moved over the darkness, and the darkness gave back shapes, and Ada stood on the threshold of a car that time had forgotten and wept without knowing she was weeping. Because it was all there. Crate stenciled Denver Relief Committee, citizens of Providence Bend, the paint still legible under 15 years of dust. Bolts of cloth wrapped in oilskin. Cases of schoolbooks, their pages foxed but whole. Kegs of nails, crated window glass packed in straw, a doctor's chest with its bottles still corked. Seed wheat in tins, long dead, but sealed with a hope you could still feel. And in the center of the car, crated like an altar, a great bronze church bell, and on its shoulder, cast into the metal itself, the words, "For Providence Bend." That she may ring again, from her friends, 1884. The relief car. Car 1131. The salvation of a whole town, bought that morning for $6 by the daughter of the man who had died in disgrace for losing it. She spent that night in the car, wrapped in donated blankets 15 years in the giving, and at first light she began, carefully, to search, because gratitude was roaring in her. But so was a question, cold and precise, and she had been raised to follow questions to their end. The strongbox was there, bolted to the floor behind the bell crate, her father's 2nd lock upon it, and she opened that one too, in the pale morning, and counted with shaking hands. The $11,000, in banknotes and gold coin, untouched. Beneath the money, in a wax paper packet, the 11 land deeds, each family's name inked in a clerk's careful copperplate: Pruitt, Halloran, Ostrander, Whitfield, names she had known her whole life. Families who had rebuilt on those lots with clouded titles and prayed nobody ever pressed the question. And beneath the deeds, at the very bottom, 2 more papers that did not belong to Denver at all. The first was the car's original waybill, the true one, stamped received at Providence Bend Depot on the 14th of September, 1884, in her father's unmistakable hand. With a note in the margin in his neat script, holding on north siding under my seal until committee convenes Thursday. E.V. He had received it. He had protected it. He had logged it honestly, and put the record where he put everything he meant to keep safe, inside, with the cargo, under his own lock. The second paper was not in her father's hand. It was a copy of a different waybill, the false one, the one the railroad's book still carried, showing car 1131 rerouted north on the 13th, the night before it ever arrived. Into the path of the Coyote Creek flood. A forgery, written before the fact, planning the car's death on paper while the car itself still rolled safely down the line. And it was signed, in the space marked forwarding clerk, with a young man's confident, climbing flourish, S. Crane. How that copy came to be in the strongbox, Ada could guess, and the guess made her cold. Her father, suspicious of his eager clerk, had found the false waybill among the depot's papers. Had understood he was looking at the first move of a theft, and had locked the evidence in with the treasure itself, meaning to bring both before the committee that Thursday. But between the finding and the Thursday, something had happened. Somebody had moved the car in the night, off the timetables, onto a spur already scheduled for abandonment, where the brush would grow and the paint would fade and nobody would look. Because everybody believed the river had it. Somebody who could alter switching orders. Somebody who then discovered, to his lifelong secret fury, that the car he had stolen was sealed with a lock he could not open and dared not be seen attacking. Somebody who had needed Elias Voss ruined and gone, so the one man who could open that door would never think to look for it. 15 years, that car had sat in the plum brush like a held breath. 15 years, Silas Crane had grown rich and respectable 4 miles from $11,000 he could not touch, waiting, perhaps, for the day the railroad would scrap the car unopened and burn his sin for him. And then a widow he had thrown into the road had bought it, out from under him, for $6. Ada sat on a crate of schoolbooks with the 2 waybills in her lap for a long time. And the temptation that visited her there was not greed. She looked at $11,000 and felt nothing but the weight of other people's names. The temptation was rage. She could ruin him. She could stand in the middle of Main Street and scream the truth and watch his smooth gray face come apart. But her father's voice was in the car with her, patient as ever. Everything closed wants to be opened, Ada, and people are harder. If she rushed this lock, it would seize. Crane was a wafer with a false gate. A widow's accusation against a bank president, evidence produced from a car she alone had opened, with no witness to what lay inside before her match was struck, he would say she had forged it all. And half the town, the half that owed him money, would find it convenient to believe him. No. This had to be lifted slowly, held, and let settle. So she did the hardest thing she had done in a hard year. She closed the strongbox, hung her father's lock back on the great door, and told no one, not yet. But a woman living in a boxcar 4 miles from town does not go unnoticed, and within a week Providence Bend was talking, and within 2 the talk reached the bank. Ada walked to town for flour and salt and felt the eyes on her, some pitying, some amused, and one pair, from the tall window of the Merchants and Stockmen's Bank, neither. Silas Crane had heard which car the crazy widow bought. She saw him on the bank steps as she passed, and he lifted his hat to her with perfect courtesy. And his eyes went over her face the way they had gone over the freight in the warehouse 30 years before, counting something. 2 days later, a rider came out the spur with papers. The bank, it seemed, had discovered an old lien, a claim that the derelict car sat on right-of-way land whose mortgage the bank had acquired. And that the sale to Mrs. Mercer was therefore void, and the car and any contents thereof were bank property, she was given 10 days to vacate. It was paper nonsense, spun overnight, but paper nonsense with a bank behind it has broken stronger people than a penniless widow, and Crane knew it. When she did not scare, he came himself, in his black buggy, and stood in the weeds in his polished boots, and offered, magnanimously, again, to buy the car from her, as a kindness. For $100. It's an eyesore and a hazard, Mrs. Mercer, and you cannot mean to winter in it. She looked at him and understood everything. He still did not know if she had gotten inside. He was probing the lock. So she gave him the false gate. She let her shoulders droop. She said the lock had beaten her like it beat everyone. She said $100 was a great deal of money. She asked, timidly, for time to think. And she watched relief loosen the corners of his mouth, and she thought, hold, and let it settle back, a hair's breadth. What she did with her 10 days was this. She wrote 3 letters in the depot waiting room, where old Dan Whitfield, the current agent, who had loved her father, let her use the pen and asked no questions. One letter went to the Denver Relief Committee's surviving secretary, a Mrs. Corliss, whose name was on the manifest. One went to the district judge in Greeley, the Honorable A.P. Sandoval, known the length of the line as a man who could not be bought because he was already rich in the only coin he valued. And one went to the division superintendent of the railroad, enclosing a copy, made in her careful hand, witnessed and notarized by Whitfield, of both waybills. Then she asked the Reverend Mr. Halloran, whose father had lost his house in the fire and whose deed lay in her strongbox, to call a town meeting for the following Sunday afternoon, on a matter, she said, concerning the whole of Providence Bend, living and dead. And she asked one thing more, that the meeting be held not in the church, but at the old Coyote Creek spur. They came. Curiosity is a stronger draft animal than duty, and by 2 o'clock that Sunday there were 300 people standing in the frost-cured grass around a derelict boxcar, farmers and shopkeepers. Widow Pruitt leaning on her granddaughter's arm, the judge down from Greeley in his plain brown coat, a Mrs. Corliss of Denver, gray and straight-backed, and, arriving late and unwillingly, drawn by the terror of what his absence would say, Silas Crane. Ada stood on an upturned crate by the great door, in her black coat, and told them the story, her father's story, plainly, without a tear in her voice, from the fire to the false waybill. And she watched 15 years of shame and suspicion shift in 300 faces like ice breaking up on the river. Then she said, my father built this lock, and he taught me its language, and I am going to open it now in front of all of you. So that no one can ever say the truth was handled in the dark. And in a silence so complete you could hear the pick working, click, and click. And the soft third voice of the last wafer, she opened her father's lock for the second time, and rolled back the door, and let the low winter sun reach into car 1131. We will not try to tell you what that sounded like, the moment 300 people saw the bell. Some sounds don't fit in words. Mrs. Corliss came forward and identified the crates by the committee's own stencils and her own 15-year-old inventory, which she had carried on the train in a carpetbag like a woman bringing a birth record to a christening. Judge Sandoval examined the true waybill in Elias Voss's hand, and then the false one in the other hand, and then he asked, in a courtroom voice that carried to the back of the crowd, whether Mr. Silas Crane was present and would care to explain his signature. And here is the quiet justice of it, no shots, no shouting, nothing you'd put in a dime novel. Crane began to speak, and his voice, that smooth instrument that had foreclosed on widows and testified against honest men, simply failed him in front of 300 pairs of eyes. Because the one audience a forger can never manage is the whole town at once. His own head clerk, a decent frightened man named Tobias Finch, stepped out of the crowd, nobody made him, and said that he had seen, years ago, in a locked drawer of Mr. Crane's private desk, a key blank filed and refiled a dozen ways, and had wondered all this time what door in Providence Bend Mr. Crane could not open. The crowd did not rush him. They did something worse to a man like Crane, they turned, family by family, and looked at the car instead, as though he had already stopped existing. Within the month the bank's directors, suddenly rediscovering their consciences, had his resignation. Within 2, the railroad's lawyers and Judge Sandoval had unwound his first theft to the root. And the fine and restitution stripped him of most of what 30 years of patience had built, and on a cold morning in January, Silas Crane left Providence Bend on the eastbound with 2 bags. And no one came to the platform, and the agent who sold him his ticket was Dan Whitfield, who said nothing at all, which was the whole town's verdict said perfectly. And the treasure? Here is the part of the story we most want you to carry home. The law was clear enough that Ada could have pressed a claim. She had bought the car and all contents, fair and public. She never let the sentence be finished in her hearing. It was never lost property, she told the judge. It was a promise delayed. You don't inherit a promise. You keep it. So the strongbox was opened before the town committee, reconvened after 15 years with 3 of its original members still living, and the promise was kept. The 11 deeds went home. Widow Pruitt held hers against her chest with both hands like a hymnal. The $11,000, grown a little by the sale of the goods the town voted to auction, rebuilt the schoolhouse in brick with a proper library. Endowed a doctor's fund so no family need ever again choose between the fever and the mortgage, and put a new roof on the Grange Hall her own Owen had built, his debt not just forgiven but reversed. His lumber finally paid for by the very money that should have been in the town's hands all along. The books went to the school. The doctor's chest went to young Dr. Ames. The seed wheat, dead as it was, they did not throw away. They mixed a handful of it into the mortar of the new school's cornerstone, so the building itself would hold the memory. And on Easter morning of the year 1900, the bronze bell, for Providence Bend, that she may ring again, was raised at last into the steeple it had waited 16 years to fill. And the first hand on the rope, by unanimous and weeping insistence of the congregation, was Ada Voss Mercer's, and folks in the far wheat quarters said afterward that they heard it plain. And stopped their teams, and stood listening in the furrows with their hats off, not knowing why. The town would have given her anything. She took almost nothing. She let them deed her back the house on Cedar Street with the window seats, that much she allowed, because Owen's hands were in every board of it, and she took one thing more, the car. Car 1131 was hauled into town on rebuilt trucks and set on a short spur behind the depot, and Ada painted it neat barn red, and hung her father's rising sun lock on the door, open, forever. On its hasp, and put a small sign over it that said Voss and Mercer, locksmith, and there she worked for the rest of her days. Mending the stubborn locks of 3 counties at a bench built from a relief crate, teaching any child who cared to sit still long enough that everything closed wants to be opened. If you'll only listen. The railroad, at Judge Sandoval's dry suggestion, sent a formal letter clearing Elias Voss's name and record, and Ada framed it. But she always said the letter that mattered had been in the strongbox all along, in the margin of a waybill, in her father's own hand, holding under my seal. He had held it. Through disgrace and death he had held it, and his daughter had come, in the fullness of time, with her $6 and her patience, and finished the sentence. So circle back with us now, to where we began, to a woman of 41 standing in the October road with a flour sack and $6.40, cast out by Silas Crane. Pitted by her neighbors, spending nearly all she had on a rusted freight car no one could unlock. They called it desperate. They called it foolish. But you know now what we know, it was neither. It was a daughter keeping faith with a father the world had written off, in a town the world had shortchanged, with a skill everyone had forgotten was worth anything at all. Ada Voss Mercer never found treasure. Treasure was never lost. Kindness 11 towns had loaded into a boxcar sat waiting in the plum brush for 15 years, and all it ever needed was one person patient enough to listen at the door. The money mattered, and the deeds mattered, and the bell still rings over the Solomon Fork Valley to this day, they say, sweeter than any bell has a right to. But the thing Ada gave Providence Bend was older than money. She proved that what is shut is not gone, that what is disgraced is not guilty, that what is abandoned is not worthless, and that sometimes the whole hope of a place is sitting in plain sight. Weathered gray, waiting for someone the world underestimated to pay $6 and refused to quit. Everything closed wants to be opened. You just have to listen long enough to learn its language. Thank you, friend, for sitting with us through Ada's story tonight. If it stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, carry more worth than the world ever writes on the ticket. And before you go, leave us your answer to this. When was a time you found real value in something, or someone, that everybody else had already written off? We read every comment, slowly, by lamplight, the way stories deserve. If you'd like more tales of quiet courage and old wrongs set right on the American frontier, subscribe and ring the bell. Ada would appreciate that particular gesture. Until next time, stay close.